Okay, this is parts 6.4, 6.5, 6.6. We've combined these sections, if you're following along on the storyboard, of managing complexity in modern societal systems. This video focuses on the conflict management function of the state, and specifically adds a bit of pluralism to the base social identity group model to look at competing elites within a complex societal system structure. And then we'll discuss the main problem of political competition, which is polar factionalism. So we're going to go back to the political process that we covered in the previous video. And we're going to walk through that using the base model, which is the social identity group model. And just to remind you of the main parts of the social identity group, we have, of course, the active, proactive, and reactive sectors. We have the societal elite, which forms the proto-state. The natural elite, which is basically the outside parameter of the curve that is the formative structure, the social form of the social identity group. And, of course, the central norm, which is basically the values that bind the social identity group together. And this is measured along two axes, the associational axes, the y-axis, which is basically the cooperative structure, the ability to associate among members to get things done, and which is a strategy of interaction. The other main, or the other principal strategy of interaction, of course, is the instrumental strategy, which focuses on coercion and force to get things done rather than cooperation. At this point, moving into the conflict management function then, a caveat that might not have been clear up to this point. The proto-state will form the state. And the state, when I mentioned earlier, is the institutional state. The state is all of the institutions and structures and ways of interacting to make decisions to affect public policy. There's a potential for a disconnect between the institutional state and the proto-state. The institutional state can be captured by the proto-state of a smaller social identity group that can then use the institutions of the state to enable it to exercise its authority over a larger group. And of course, this is the main form of autocracy, which we dealt with in video 14. But just keep in mind that when thinking about the state, what we're talking about is the ideal or the most simple idea of the proto-state and the state as being congruent. But keep in mind that there can be a disconnect which can lead to additional problems of societal system development. So moving on then, the main type of interaction, political interaction, in the political process model is conventional politics. And conventional politics is just getting things done. It's directed behavior, it's cooperative behavior, it's goal-oriented behavior that the proto-state directs for the benefit of the social identity group as a whole. And this is necessarily done by the proactive sector. Within the structure of the social identity group, as we get into complexity, which is, of course, an outcome of societal system development and pluralism. In the most simple form, then, we see that in the more advanced social identity group, the complex social identity group, there's a tendency towards a polar structure, a nascent polar structure that organizes competing elites. That there are different perspectives within this complex structure, and the main ones are the active and the reactive, which are activated or socially activist. The proto-state is neutral. It's the conflict management function. It performs the conflict management function based on the strains and stresses of disagreement between the active and the reactive sectors. And the active and reactive sectors tend to organize over a period of time through experience, through institutionalization of ways of interacting that have proven themselves to be useful and to work in this particular context. And they tend towards forming two groups. And we see that in many modern complex societal systems, that there are two main political parties that represent the active and reactive sectors, the entrepreneurial, the ones that, as we know, the active sector is motivated by basically self-aggrandizement, meaning that they initiate political action. The reactive sector tends to respond to the initiation of political action, to point out any issues that arise from this initiation of active political action. So we get in a reactive reaction to active action. And the conflict management function then that's supplied by the proto-state, the proactive, strongly proactive sector of the societal system, is to manage the conflict between these two competing structures of and the elites that guide them or lead them. And so the conflict management function is essentially separated from the issues under discussion. Conflict management function basically tries to accommodate the tension between these two groups and reduce that tension by formulating a policy that is at least satisficing, to use Herbert Simon's term, to both groups, and brings their competing elite, the norms that are represented by the competing elites, brings those back to the middle, which is a non-instrumental norm. It's heavily proactive norm, and it approaches the common norm, the relative zero. And so the conflict management function, in its essential quality, does that. As the tensions between these groups separate them, the conflict management function is stimulated to find an innovative policy that will reduce the tension between these groups and bring those two competing norms back towards the central norm or the common norm. And this happens continually as new issues come up and are expressed through these lower structures. They get channeled up to the proto-state and negotiated amongst the proactive elite, who then can formulate a response and promulgate a policy response to reduce the tension. Over time, of course, this is all done in a non-crisis mode. This is normal politics. This is normative politics. And it's all negotiated politics. There's very little coercion applied. There may be some minor coercion as each group tries to increase its leverage to affect or to influence the resolution. But if it increases to an inordinate degree, a non-normal degree of tension, it can be expressed in the second stage in the political process model, the second escalation, if you will, into contentious politics. This means that an issue has come up, has created tension. The proactive state either doesn't have the technology or has not identified an innovative solution that will satisfy both of the competing or all of the competing groups. And so the tension remains over a duration. And the longer that tension remains, the more contentious that interaction tends to become. And so we'll see that under certain circumstances, issues will come up of high value, of course. These are not trivial issues. These are issues that are important to this second order groupings. And so they're highly valued issues. This can lead to increasing tension and the use of higher amounts of coercion between these competing groups that are being led by these competing elites. Of course, the conflict management function is still in effect. It still needs to bring these groups back together towards the common norm. It's just a little bit more difficult. It takes a greater degree of integration, and of course, this is the tension that actually creates innovation. The more tension, the more unique the problem, the more difficult the identification of a solution, the more innovation and entrepreneurial response is necessary in order to effect a resolution to this conflict. Assuming that this contentious politics can be brought back to the norm, another issue of great importance might come up that really is very difficult to resolve. And again, this is a degree of difficulty. As the proactive or the proactive sector, the proto-state, is attempting to manage conflicts amongst these competing elites and these competing groups. The contentiousness of politics may increase even further into more instrumental behavior and more instrumental tension between these groups, the appearance of more coercive measures, more push and pull, the more forceful language, more forceful maneuvers to try and affect a resolution to benefit one group or the other. It can lapse into the next phase, which is issue factionalism. An issue has become so difficult to resolve that it actually starts to be consolidated and integrated into the identity of the competing groups. It's starting to become a characteristic of the competition between the elites. Well, as you get to the point of issue factionalism, you're starting to move into a political crisis. And this is a political crisis for the proto-state in making sure that they can manage this conflict and find this innovative resolution. Because as these competing elites move their identity groups away from the common norm and using more instrumental behavior, we see what the real problem of social contention is. And that is that there's an increase in social cost. That as these groups move apart, they're engaging in activity that's mainly contentious rather than productive. And we can conceptualize this as we have in the past with societal inefficiencies. This is relative inefficiency. We have two groups expending a lot of time and energy and resources in competing with one another rather than producing a common public good. And this comes at a social cost. And this social cost can be thought of as the social cost of contention. Of course, as these issues become even more contentious, more coercive, the social costs continue to grow. And so anytime the curves of the competing elites go outside the lines, right, of the normative limits of the main or the common social identity group, we're seeing an increase in economic inefficiencies that have the social cost. And if this contention, if this coercion, this competition persists over long periods of time, of course, this has a detrimental effect on the common societal system. And as you may recall from earlier video, this will eventually lead to an atrophy, which will reduce the potential of the group itself because of the increased costs of everyday interactions. So, we see that the conflict management becomes more difficult as the issues become more contentious and the resolutions are more difficult to identify that are common enough to be accepted by both or all competing parties. So it can actually, if a resolution can't be identified and implemented, we can see that the competing elites may escalate their positions and the strength of the contention due to the increased tensions of not being able to pursue their goals vis-a-vis or their interests vis-a-vis a certain particular issue. And of course, as the duration goes on, we see the societal inefficiencies, economic inefficiencies mount. As a feedback, we see an atrophy within the societal system itself. And this will, of course, contribute to the rise of new issues of contention and new issues that need to be resolved. And you'll see multiple issues of contention, multiple issues of factionalism. And as these issues multiply or compound, they start to be packaged into political platforms, which then become a part of identity itself. They can then expressed in symbolic terms in that our differences are many and they are expressed by our sub-level social identity. That our loyalties start shifting away from the common social identity towards the sub-identity, which is the political party, or if it's organized along an ethnic marker, it can be an ethnic group. Anything can organize these, but in modern societal systems, it's most commonly organized by political parties. So, in the condition of polar factionalism, then, we have multiple issues of contention, all of which are begging resolution. The more issues that you have, the more complicated the terms of the contentiousness, the more pressure that's being placed because of the coercive activities and behaviors of the competing groups, trying to gain advantage or trying to gain leverage over the oppositional group. We see greater expenditures of energy, resources, and time in the contention rather than in common production for the benefit of all. And we get this problem of polar factionalism. that the groups now have migrated to a point where it's difficult for them to see commonalities, and even if common solutions are found, they may not be recognized by the competing elites. The competing elites are now starting to see that their own fortunes are tied in with their leadership of this faction and these competing factions, and it makes not only the resolution of the contention more difficult to manage, it also makes the willingness to accept resolutions more difficult to attain. And this can be then a self-motivated, self-driving dynamic that actually pulls these groups into oppositional postures. They become more contentious, they become more competing, and they're starting to see things rather than a positive sum game. They're starting to couch their understandings in a win-lose situation, a negative sum game. And so we see more energy put into the crisis norms, the active and reactive. We're seeing more energy and loyalty being devoted to the maintenance of these competing groups. And the common group, the proto-state, the proactive groups, are losing relevance in this contention between these polarized groups. So, extensive research has pointed out that this condition of polar factionalism is both a nexus and a critical juncture in the political process. Now, as we've been looking at this idealized version so that we can focus on the critical structures and the critical dynamics of conflict management and its devolution into polar factionalism, we can also see parallels with this problem of societal system disintegration, which we've been talking about so far, the parallel with the problems of societal integration that occur during the development process that we covered in video 14 with the question of where does autocracy come from? Autocracy itself tends to create or build off of a base condition of polar factionalism and institutionalize that as a mode of authority and a rationalization for using autocratic instrumentalities to maintain the social order. So we're seeing that the breakdown of a societal system starts to resemble the struggles to transition from autocratic to democratic authority. And so there's a very critical nexus here. Now, when we're talking about conventional politics, the non-crisis mode of interaction, what we're really emphasizing is what we commonly refer to as the rule of law. The rule of law, as I've already argued, is based on voluntary compliance, which itself is based on a sense of legitimacy, a sense that common policies in net effect benefit all. And so your best option, your best strategy is the proactive option and non-coercive interaction, emphasizing cooperative interaction to get things done more effectively and more efficiently. As polar factionalism starts to come to the fore, of course, we also have to keep in mind another complicating factor, as I've discussed through this video so far, that the conflict management function, in its innovation of resolution, tends to satisfy rather than totally satisfy. We often, I won't say we don't ever, but we often see resolutions that are minimally acceptable or that carry major caveats. And so when polar factionalism becomes the defining quality of the interaction between competing elites, they start to go back and bring up former resolutions and former issues that had no longer been politically active, and they're seeing redefining those moments, redefining those issues and saying, well, we didn't get a perfect resolution to that particular issue. So they add that issue to the raft of issues that now identify their differences rather than their commonalities. And so polar factionalism is a juncture. It's a juncture in which the societal system moves from predominantly associational strategies and negotiated outcomes and common policy, and starts to move towards differential policies, differential outcomes, symbolic definition and symbolic identifications. And symbolic identity is non-negotiable, and this is part of the issue of polar factionalism that resists resolution. And so the conflict management function really has an imperative to resolve conflicts as they come up in the shortest time possible to satisfy the contending parties or the contentious parties. Because things start to slow down. If resolutions are found, of course, resilience of the societal system tends to bring these parties back together. As soon as a resolution to an issue of factionalism can be found, if you have issue factionalism, they come back to the norm fairly quickly. They tend to migrate out from the norm fairly slowly, so relatively slowly. As they escalate to further along the instrumental differential with the contentiousness of the competing elites, they tend to defy resolution. They tend to want to stay in these more contentious postures. And so we have this slowing down as we move out, and this tendency to want to stay in these polarized postures. The resolution is found, they tend to come together again and get beyond the contentiousness or the factionalism that they'd experienced in the past, back to favoring common policy. So we're in polar factionalism, either because of the disintegration of a complex societal system, a well-developed societal system, or issues of a societal development in lesser developed societies trying to reach this point of more complex levels or more advanced levels of societal system development. So we have a nexus. At this point, we have a critical juncture, as I pointed out, where a decision has to be made, and it has to be made not by any particular party, but all parties in congruence. That they have to see that they've reached this critical juncture and work harder to resolve their differences. If they don't, then the tendency is towards the use of ever-escalating instrumentalities, which then necessitates the introduction of militancy. Militancy, of course, is an escalation in instrumentality. Militancy is the initiation of force rather than simply coercive interactions. Coercive interactions basically are trying to use common values to leverage one position and get another group that to see your point of view. Force is moving beyond that leverage principle to say that this is the point of view and we can force a resolution in our favor that you will have to accept. And so it really starts to see this zero-sum interaction in terms that they have to win, and that they will win by forcefully promoting their own interests to the detriment of the interests of the opposition. So militant postures come into play to try and increase this ability to prevail in this contentious interaction. And in militancy, as I'll argue a little bit later in this video, militancy first appears as a political action, as a militant group within either the active or reactive group, takes it on their own initiative to start engaging in forceful action. And when I use the term forceful action, I'm talking about either political violence or the threat of political violence. But as the threat of political violence is only real once it's been demonstrated, then we can say fairly confidently that political violence is the issue in this escalation in the political process from polar factionalism to militancy. Of course, the option to come back together to resolve their differences is still available, although more complicated and difficult. The option to militancy becomes intuitively favorable because it negates the necessity of gaining the acceptance of an opposition, which is increasingly recalcitrant or resistant to negotiated outcomes. So the forceful option becomes favored in these situations. And so historically, the evidence has shown that two trajectories tend to be favored at the point of polar factionalism. At lower levels of systemic development and societal systemic development in the sublevel case, we see two options being favored. One is for one group to use its advantages in instrumental action, its ability to impose force in the resolution of a issue of contention or a packaged bunch of issues or polarized issues. And it will crack down. It will basically seize control of the institutional state and to impose its interests on the oppositional group, meaning it's going to subjugate and subordinate the interests of the oppositional group to its own interests. And so we see this as a very common outcome, especially in the development process, in the difficulty of transitioning from autocratic to more democratic authority, of actually placing the institutional state and transitioning it from control by the active group to the proactive group. That's the democratic transition. So, the other option, of course, is the inability of either of the groups to impose its will and force a resolution to this contention, and that is to lapse into greater militancy, political violence, and finally into civil war, and if the civil war continues, to extract social costs of inefficiency to state failure. Okay, so civil warfare, separation, state failure, collapse of central authority are the full escalation of social contention. Taking a step back to talk about how this comes about in a little bit more detail. We've talked about the separation of opposition regarding issues, how they're bundled together, how they're then transferred into symbolic terms that are non-negotiable and become embedded in separate identities and in the disintegration of the common identity at this point. When force, and especially political violence, come into play during militancy, the main victim, then of course there are human victims, of course, and we can't forget them. But the main victim from a societal system perspective are the linkages amongst groups. And this is has more to do with the pluralistic element of societal system, complex societal systems and societal system development. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this particular video. But force and violence start to destroy linkages. Linkages amongst groupings, linkages amongst individuals, basically because they destroy trust in negotiated outcomes. The negotiations at this point, up to this point, have been difficult. Once political violence comes into play, negotiated outcomes are not even perceived as being possible, because in order to negotiate, you have to trust that all parties to the negotiated settlement are going to follow through with their commitments towards a common understanding and common activity. And having seen it demonstrated that they have been unwilling in the recent past to do this, it's very difficult to reestablish that sense that they're now willing to do that, or they now can be trusted to follow through with their commitments. And so accountability becomes the main victim in this escalatory process. That accountability is still in play in polar factionalism, although it's severely strained once you lapse into militancy, and especially into civil war. Accountability is basically devastated. So we'll get back into that as we talk further into this. Then the other point of polar factionalism that we need to keep in mind, especially recently as we now are progressing in general societal system development, and we're now see a democracy predominant world, we now see evidence of a third option in polar factionalism. In countries that have experienced in the past, as I've gone through with this narrative, this is a country or a societal system that has experienced democratic governance, because democratic governance is necessarily non-instrumental, it emphasizes associational interaction, and is guided by the proactive sector. Once that occurs, that becomes a viable option. It's a more viable option because you had a historical experience with this, and you've known that you've been able to negotiate in the past, and even though you're seeing an increase in coercion or force and maybe even political violence, the historical experience can overcome the damage to the linkages and help through with the accountability. All we have to do is reestablish accountability in the post-conflict scenario as you build down towards regaining conventional politics on the common norm, in the common identity. As far as transition from autocracy to democratic, or transitioning from active control of the social order, active authority, to proactive authority, this democratic transition that we've already discussed, this has become a third option. The other two options, of course, were an increase in autocratic authority by the active group or the reactive group in a revolutionary situation to reimpose a biased social order, a lapse into chaos, anarchy, and civil war. A third option has emerged in that the condition of polar factionalism actually can be seen as a gateway to stimulating contending groups to negotiate outcomes and actually then gain democratization. Evidence tends to point that this is not a self-motivated or a self-actuated outcome, that this needs a good neighborhood. It needs to be encouraged and supported from third parties in order to make this effective. But we are starting to see this third option come into play as democratic governance is becoming more prevalent throughout the global system. Of course, this brings to mind this problem of an illusion of transition that at lower levels of societal development that are trying to transition from autocratic to democratic rule, having experienced polar factionalism, having experienced onsets of civil warfare, and having the duration and the scope and magnitude of that civil war be intense enough to gain the attention of the opposing parties, to basically coerce them to see that perhaps a negotiated settlement is preferred rather than continuing this destructive interaction. William Zartman has called this famously a herding stalemate, that the two parties have exhausted their coercive potential, their ability to impose force on the other. They're starting to see a no-win situation, and so they negotiate an outcome. However, without an experience in negotiated outcomes, without confidence that a common identity can be regained or established and become effective, what we often see from research, from the empirical evidence, is this illusion of transition, in that as the parties of opposition and contention are exhausted, they're no longer willing to pursue an instrumental option or an instrumental strategy in the resolution of their conflicts. They accept negotiated solutions temporarily, and often just until they've recovered their ability to then again pursue coercive strategies in a re-escalation of this conflict. And so they basically get stuck at polar factionalism. They give it a patina or an illusion of negotiated resolution, but it never really moves past the condition of polar factionalism. And then once the opposing sides recover their potential, they re-engage in instrumental strategies, and you see a re-initiation of political violence and civil warfare. As this then plays out, we see the effect that it has on the common identity group. And I've already mentioned that proactive resolution basically becomes irrelevant in a coercive, forceful, or violent confrontation amongst opposing groups. That when instrumental strategies are so prominent and so strong, negotiated solutions seem to be almost not irrelevant, if disloyal, subversive even, or even treasonous, because it's inimical to now the prominent interest being expressed by the competing elites. No matter which side you're on, any petition for a negotiated outcome is seen as seditious. At this point, the proactive sector and the formulation of the proto-state in the common social identity group starts to collapse. And this is what we mean by the collapse of central authority. The loyalties of then the proactive sector of the common identity are forced basically either to emigrate out of the system completely because they're now being seen as treasonous, or they have to shift their loyalty away from the common to one of the polar norms. And at this point, it's very difficult for this societal system to recover and regain non-crisis mode and conventional politics. Reintegration. By way of summary, then, of the arguments that I've made so far, we can plot this political process in a third way, right? We've talked about a political process in the generic terms. We've applied it to our social identity group modeling methodology. And now we can look at this course of escalation over time using a common graph, using two axes. The x-axis is time, of course, and the y-axis is this escalation of the political process and the contention within it. And you'll see this graph is just a representative graph. You'll see that it starts out in conventional politics, it escalates up into contentious politics, it goes back down, the conflict management function goes back into conventional politics, and then we see an escalatory sequence. It goes up into contentious politics, levels off for a while, the issue isn't resolved, it then goes up into issue factionalism, it again levels off for a while, because the issue just exacerbates because of the lack of resolution. Groups who are on either side of this issue, this factionalized issue, start to reflect on other differences. They bring these to bear. At some point, there's a crisis. There's a crisis of resolution. This is a normative crisis, and something will happen. And we often see these in the social dynamics, societal system dynamics. There's a polarizing phenomenon, and we never know what it is. Some people call it a trigger event. But something of great symbolic content, emotive content at this point, right? Because we also know that the emotive content of the political process increases over the course of this escalation. And so we're at polar factionalism or coming into polar factionalism. What it either, well, it's actually a defining moment, right, of the transition from issue factionalism to polar factionalism. There'll be something that large numbers of the members of these competing groups see as symbolic of their contention and the importance that they've attached to this issue of contention. They'll start to reflect and start to package then multiple issues of difference, turn them into contentious issues if they haven't been already, realize that they weren't satisfied with prior resolutions. And so we see the onset then in the further escalation of the political process to polar factionalism. The polar factionalism will last for a period of time, and empirically we've found that this is true, that there is no spontaneous lapse into political violence. If for no other reason, political violence being an organized activity that is highly skilled and requires organization of militants, especially from the opposition side, it takes a period of time in order to accomplish. And so there are incentives to remain in this condition of polar factionalism, and which gives time to resolve this crisis. If the crisis isn't resolved and the polar factionalism continues to fester, there could be an escalation, and it can escalate, de-escalate. But until this resolving moment, this epiphany, if you will, is possible. This is the decision point. In polar factionalism, this is why it becomes the critical juncture, the nexus in societal development, in the transition from autocracy to democracy. There's a decision point at the societal level, the societal system level, on which way to go. Either to de-escalate and regain conventional politics and have the democratic methodology, the associational strategies become predominant. This is, of course, a very new phenomenon. It wasn't really an option for most developing countries. It's very difficult for this condition to become possible. Historically, as more and more countries have become democratic, it's become created good neighborhoods. They've created third-party support for these transitions. They become more possible, more probable as an outcome, but still the lesser of all the options. It can stay in the condition of polar factionalism by the emergence of a dominating instrumental authority, autocratic authority, then defines the nature relationship between the active and reactive oppositional groups, with the proactive group receding into the background, at least in the present and the medium term, until they can then reemerge and hopefully then stimulate a democratic transition at some future point after the opposition, the emotive content of the oppositional activity dissipates. The third option, which is the most prominent or prevalent option in these cases after adverse regime change, and even adverse regime change doesn't always forestall the third option. Adverse regime change may actually trigger the third option, and that is the onset of civil war, which leads to societal system disintegration, fragmentation, and possibly the collapse of central authority. And so we see another crisis point at the onset of civil war, which again requires a resolution, but a peaceful resolution at this point is very problematic and highly unlikely. Okay, up till now, we've used the most simple expression of a complex societal system in order to focus on the principal dynamics of political contention that drive, or at least characterize, the political process and the escalation in the contention and the shift from associational to instrumental strategies. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind that these are complex societal systems, and complex societal systems are characterized by pluralism. Pluralism is an expression of increasing complexity as special interests self-actuate and new social identity groups, subordinate social identity groups, form within the complex societal system. This gives it a greater latitude in political action. It makes conflict management much more effective and efficient because issues can be dealt with at lower levels. We get the principles of subsidiarity coming into play, so the conflict management function doesn't have to be handled at the highest order protostate, that it can be handled at lower orders of protostate, at subordinate levels of social identity, of political organization. So let's add pluralism in and illustrate what it looks like to a certain degree. In modern complex systems, we're talking about tens, hundreds, or even millions of lower order or subordinate social identity groups within a complex societal system. I can't present that in this modeling technique, and so I'm going to present the most complex expression of pluralism that I can without getting carried away. And this is one expression of pluralism within the context of a single complex societal system. In basic principle, as social groups, as you recall, are self-actuating, self-organizing, self-regulating, and self-correcting, there's a potential for self-actuation of a subordinate or a lower order social identity group anywhere within the complex societal system. Of course, the principle also is that if it forms with an active posture, it's either going to be, it will create its mirror reflection in a reactive group that will form in response to the formation of the active group. And so these groups, the active and the reactive, will always balance themselves out within the confines or the definitional or identity confines of the complex societal group. Of course, the conflict management function at the highest order of social in this complex societal system, in the proto-state, is to bring these social norms, these lower order subordinate identity norms towards the common norm. And so this is a very chaotic presentation of pluralism and really displays a lower level of societal system integration. Over time, conflict management function should start bringing the norms in towards the center and thereby discouraging the formation of groups at the extremes or at the instrumental margins of the social identity. If it can do that, of course, then the shape of the complex societal system curve comes in, and you lessen the latitude or the distance of instrumental strategies that occur within that higher order identity group. Well, this isn't illustrative or doesn't fit in with our current argument, which is to deal with the issue of the political process, the onset of polar factionalism, and its devolution into warfare, societal warfare, and potential for state failure. So let's take it back a step. And in this case, we can look at a societal system that is at the point of transition. We have an active group that has a fairly strong identity, and it is able, as we argued in video 14, it uses autocratic authority to establish and maintain a social order that includes both the proactive and the reactive group. The active group can actually be smaller in mass, in social mass, than the reactive group, but the basic principle is that the distance along the instrumental axis times the population or the social mass of the active group has to equal the distance along the instrumental axis times the social mass of the reactive group in order to stay in balance. And this balance is the basic principle of societal systems theory. Well, if we add then the pluralism element, we can see why the active group can maintain autocratic authority over a long period of time. We see that the active group actually does this because it learns to manage conflict within itself. It has already progressed to the point where it has reached a level of identity coherence and political discipline so that it is economically efficient, which allows it to act vis-a-vis a disorganized, incoherent, and undisciplined oppositional group much more effectively, and keep it then actively from reaching and attaining these levels of coherence and discipline and organization. So the active group, in order to maintain, uses autocratic authority. Hopefully the threat of force, having demonstrated that it has the potential to use force and actually has used force in the past effectively, it can use the threat of force then to prevent the reactive group from gaining coherence, from developing effective organizations, and from gaining any kind of alliance between groups, and of course then any kind of discipline to oppose the will of the active group. And this is what maintains autocracy over a long period of time. The proactive group, as argued in video 14, is basically seen as a benefit to both groups, and so it's ignored politically, and it forms basically in political isolation. As long as it remains politically neutral, it's not seen as a threat. Its level of production, its efficiency of economic production makes it a benefit for creating goods that are then expropriated or otherwise taxed and shifted to the active group. It employs the reactive group and gives it sustenance and maintains this group even under its conditions of exploitation and subordination. Over time, we see, of course, that the proactive group becomes more politically active, but also the reactive group, having been prevented in its pluralistic sense from gaining a greater cohesion and discipline, the incentives then, because negotiation and negotiated outcomes are not working. There's no concessions by the active group. There's a strong incentive for a militant group to form in order to increase the pressure on the active group, or at least express the frustration of the reactive group against the exploitation. And so there's over time and over a history of the active group actually actively engaging to thwart the aspirations of the oppositional group, we almost invariably see a militant group form in the opposition. It doesn't form directly in the opposition. It seems to be removed from the oppositional group, but the oppositional group finds them useful. And so there is a tie between them, basically a marriage of mutual interest. The oppositional group prefers not to use militant violence or militancy or instrumental violence to try and gain leverage vis-a-vis the active group, but it's not opposed to it. And so it acts as a cover for this emerging militant oppositional group, reactive group. And history is replete with this. This is probably the most common outcome of autocratic rule. And then the active group has an incentive not only to prevent, again, the organization and the integration of the militant group with the oppositional group, but it also gains raison d'etre for maintaining autocratic rule because of this militant activity. It rationalizes that it is the guarantor of the social order by using its own coercion, force, and even political violence to control this oppositional militant group. of course, in order to get to them, because they are shrouded or concealed by this favorable, if not completely cooperative, oppositional group, the active group having trouble because the militant group is so small and mobile in most cases, it tends to increase its coercion against the oppositional group. And that tends to increase the coherence and cohesion and discipline of the oppositional group, which then creates a crisis which favors the transition of political authority from the active to the proactive group, in order to forestall the worst outcome, which is a revolution, whereas the larger reactive group then is able to use its advantages in size then to displace the active group and have a revolution where the reactive group then becomes the active group becomes the reactive group, and this dislocation, social dislocation of identity, is extremely problematic and largely explains why we see revolutions actually devolving into the even worse, the worst possible outcome. Lastly, I want to point out with this, of course, the emotive content is always here in these kinds of extreme tension situations. The social tension, the rise of militancy. Once political violence comes into play, we have the right conditions for the self-actuation of extremist groups. Extremists are normally, under non-crisis conditions, sociopathic, meaning that they are not self-actuating. They do not, under normal conditions or non-crisis conditions, organize. And this is to the benefit of the social order, that extremists don't organize, because extremists, when they're organized, can create enormous disruption and enormous havoc with very small groups, and even loosely organized groups. So extremist groups, the empirical evidence points out very strongly that extremist groups only appear under extremely adverse conditions where political violence has come into play and has continued to wreak havoc in this contention between active and reactive groups for a long period of time. The longer the period, the higher the magnitude, intensity, and scope of the political violence, the more likely this pressure, this social pressure, and this changing of conditions actually will lead extremists to self-identify, because we now, under conditions of political violence, have impunity of the extremist mindset, and they can actually identify other extremists, and under these conditions of reacting to political violence, extremism becomes actual viable identity formation. That there then can be a coherence in extremism, but only under extreme conditions. Remove the extreme conditions, and the extremist groups will tend to disintegrate almost immediately, and mainly because they will use extremist action against each other, because that's what they do. And having engaged in extreme activity, they are predisposed to continue extreme behavior.